So now that the Resident Evil 4 remake has been released and had proven to be a big success in Capcom's remake selection, one would only imagine now that it's only a matter of time before Capcom ultimately decides in remaking Resident Evil 5, to which by now, after playing the Resident Evil 4 remake, I don't think would be such a bad idea, as joining me right now to tackle the subject of a possibility of there being a Resident Evil 5 remake is my good friend and YouTuber known as Mark and I. Now Mark, me and you are huge Resident Evil fans, and I think that at first me and you were kind of hesitant on not just seeing a Resident Evil 4 remake, but also being a little weary of them messing it up like they did with Resident Evil 3, but in my own opinion, and I can only speak on behalf of myself, I think that the Resident Evil 4 remake is one of the best remakes, if not the best remake in Capcom's lineup, and so to see a possibility of there being a Resident Evil 5 remake now, I don't think would be such a bad idea, because not only would they be able to expand upon the gameplay and improving that, but also expanding upon the enemies and making everything feel and look that much more sinister and dangerous and kind of gritty as they did with Resident Evil 4's remake. And so what I wanted to know from you initially are your thoughts on the people that don't really want or are kind of clamoring down in going against the idea of there being a Resident Evil 5 remake, because either they want to see Code Veronica be remade next, which I agree upon, but just to see those that are Debbie Downers and thinking that Resident Evil 5 can't possibly improve upon its overall delivery is something that I do want to go ahead and get your thoughts on top of the fact that if you believe that if there were to be a Resident Evil 5 remake, that it would live up to expectations in being possibly one of the best remakes following Resident Evil 4.
My position was the moment that we found out that Resident Evil 4 was getting a remake, Resident Evil 5 was coming right after it. Ever since there was that leak through, I think, the NVIDIA database or Steam database, there was something that NVIDIA did where they released or something got leaked where it showed all these upcoming games, all these ports that were coming, PlayStation Studios games becoming PC, all this stuff that turned out to be 100% true. So once we knew that a Resident Evil 4 remake was happening, you could tell that Resident Evil 5 was going to happen because the stories linked together so well and so closely. And I think the remake confirms that, like you said, with the inclusion of Wesker and like so many other little things. Like, you know, there was no doubt in my mind that it was going to happen. I loved Resident Evil 5. Like, I really enjoyed the game. I can see why some people had some issues with it at first regarding like the action over the survival horror side of it. Totally get that. Makes perfect sense. I get why people have a problem with it. But considering Resident Evil 4 shared very similar elements in that regard, a lot of action over survival horror, I knew that once this remake showed that it was focusing on trying to rein that in and focus on the survival horror aspect again while improving upon literally everything else, that they could do it, and they most certainly will with Resident Evil 5. So I think that they need to remake it. I think they could flesh out the scenery a lot more. I think for me, the only times I ever really felt like I wasn't like feeling scared or that sort of Resident Evil intensity was throughout the times where you were so close with Sheva. I think having a partner in those scenes or in the game made it a little bit less scary because you weren't alone. I like feeling like I'm on my own, and so once you have someone that has your back, that sort of takes away from that fear a little bit. Now I know in Resident Evil 4, just as an aside, since we're kind of covering a wide set of subtopics here, Resident Evil 4 is different in that Ashley, who is a companion, doesn't really have your back in that way. I don't feel safer knowing that Ashley's at my side. Like, I just don't. And that's just because she's not a fighter, she's not a survivalist in that way, she's just, you know, a prissy little presidential daughter, and we're there to save her. It's different with the dynamic between Chris and Sheva. That being said, I think with everything they've improved, visually, control-wise, like the right amount of action, but also retaining like a new sense of scariness and like environmental ambiance, they could very easily do that with Resident Evil 5 and do it exceptionally well. I think everything that they've done with Resident Evil 4, as long as they follow what they did with Resident Evil 2 and not with Resident Evil 3, then we'll be in good shape. Because I think Resident Evil 2, that remake, was incredible. Resident Evil 3 was still very, very good as a remake. The problem with that game was the length. That's what people were irritated by. I didn't really hear, I mean, everyone has their own subjective opinions. I totally get that. But I certainly don't think you could subjectively say Resident Evil 3 Remake was a bad game. It was made by a different studio than Resident Evil 2, but if I'm not mistaken, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4 were made by the same group. And because of all this overwhelming critical acclaim that not just Resident Evil is getting, but also games like Dead Space, it's showing a renewed interest in survival horror, and Capcom is not ignoring that. And I think seeing that Resident Evil 4 did so well, if Resident Evil 5 wasn't already in development, they're definitely going to do it. Because for one, they can. For 2, they need more time before they flesh out what's coming next in the Resident Evil world, because there's a lot of big things coming, and we've wrapped things up with the Winters family. So they need to take their time, and that's totally okay. The best way to do that is to focus on older games to bring in a whole new generation and demographic of Resident Evil fans. And also, since you've already remade the 2nd and 3rd and 4th games, all to critical acclaim for the most part, then it would make sense to continue on with 5. To be honest, I'm more like wondering whether or not they're going to do the same thing with Resident Evil 6, but that's a whole other topic. As far as like the improvements in Resident Evil 5, I mean, I don't think you need to change the formula at all. I think they can just do what they're doing with Resident Evil 4, and that is basically just polish everything up, make it look like a game that you'd expect in 2023 or later. Obviously, it's going to come out, and if it does come out, 2024 or 2025. So it would need to look like that. It would need to feel like that. Upgraded dialogue, maybe some side missions and some side quests. I think they did a good job with adding those little like side objectives that you could do. Kill the snakes, collect all the medallions, things like that. And then expand on some areas. I think you could really do a good job of showing a lot more of Africa. It felt really barren because you're in the desert, but I think they could still improve upon that a little bit. And as long as it's the same group that did 2 and 4, then I don't think that they can fail. And I think Capcom is starting to really appreciate the fan base for supporting the series and showing a renewed interest in survival horror, because we need, I think, more AAA titles that respect the fandom in that regard more than ever.
And you know, to add on top of that, I think that for me personally, seeing the beginning of the game involving Chris and the village that is infamous in Africa, and seeing how everyone was looking at Chris, and then all of a sudden everyone is gone, and then only for you to there find yourself in another village fight similar to that of 4, only in 5, but this time you're dealing with this giant axe hammer swinging enemy on top of many other kind of deranged Ouroboros-like villagers at the same time. So a lot of this, do I think, can be improved upon, on top of making Africa's environment seem that much more dangerous, because when looking back on the game, of course, for me, it wasn't my favorite. I definitely prefer 4 over 5 in my own opinion, but they could definitely upscale so much in making the enemies look vicious, in making even Wesker look that much more vicious, in giving us more of a dynamic involving Sheva and Chris. But what I also wanted to know is, what are your thoughts on those within the fandom that completely reject the idea of remakes, despite the fact that they're holding on to older games, they're holding on to nostalgia, and they don't think that Resident Evil 5 could possibly even be improved upon, because they think that the game, in their own mind, is perfect the way it is.
I think everyone has a right to express any sort of criticism, or a skepticism rather. I think it's completely within a justifiable reasoning to worry, because really we're in an era right now where live games are dominating. Season passes, cosmetics, microtransactions, cash grabs, games that are being released half-baked or not baked at all, and then they expect at some point that they'll just, have a day one patch that it comes 6 months later. I mean, there's been so many games that have been hyped over the years that turned out to be a massive flop and disappointment that have been long since forgotten. I don't know if Capcom is the type of company, when it comes to managing Resident Evil as a franchise, I don't know if I feel that they would be like, oh wow, people love Resident Evil so much, let's just turn out a massive pile of garbage like for our next game and tarnish our good name just for some extra cash. I don't think that they look at it like that. I'm sure maybe there are some executives in there that are like, okay, what can we do to maximize profits and just rush Resident Evil 5 Remake and just push that out and then, whatever, move on. They're gonna buy it no matter what. I'm not convinced that's how they're looking at this, and I really hope that someone in charge doesn't prove me wrong, because that would really suck. I don't want like these big corporations taking these brands that we love and doing a remake for the sake of making money. And I think there's a lot of different ways that you can look at what a remake means. I mean, look at all the Disney movie remakes, and I'm not going to get all political here on that, but what I will say is, like, they're very, how do I word this? It's very obvious to me that a lot of companies are trying to pretend that they are considering your feelings and considering a level of inclusivity, when really they're trying to manipulate certain demographics to buying their product while it comes out, like, not very well thought out. When it comes to video games, it can be the same thing. a remake just for the sake of like, okay, I'm just going to rush this shit just so we can cash in because we are being lazy. I don't think Capcom has demonstrated that. I think there was a different studio that kind of made people worry when it came to Resident Evil 3, and people were worried that that was going to be the same experience with Resident Evil 4. And I understand that, and I was worried about that too. But it wasn't the case. Resident Evil 2 showed they did it right. Resident Evil 3 showed they put the wrong people on the job. And that's not necessarily a developer's fault. I mean, to a certain extent, you could probably blame some aspect of developmental leadership, but ultimately it's the executives there, and they made a mistake. Whether or not they had that Resident Evil 2 team working on something else and they couldn't do 3, or they decided to cut corners and try something a little bit cheaper by having a different team do 3, and, you know, I don't know. But I think it's pretty obvious that after the remake of 3, they decided to go back with the formula and the team that did well with 2, and they knocked it out of the park. And I would say that 4, by every conceivable measure, is better than the Resident Evil 2 remake. I would say it's without a doubt the best game in the Resident Evil franchise, bar none. I think that there's a lot of really great things happening with Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8, and I think seeing that they've improved on their remake model and found a really sweet spot to be in with the Resident Evil 4 remake tells me that as long as they don't lose sight of that, Resident Evil 5 as a remake could be a masterpiece. Now, it won't be as good as Resident Evil 4 just because I think that by comparison, Resident Evil 5, for whatever it did right or wrong, and Resident Evil 4 in the same boat, like you can't really fairly compare the two. Resident Evil 4 is probably the most beloved entry in the entire Resident Evil franchise. So it getting a perfect remake like this, I don't think Resident Evil 5 is ever going to be able to have the necessary variables and factors to make it on par with that, only because you're going against like perfection twice. The first game almost at perfection to the point where I would say it's pretty much there, and then the remake. I think that as long as Capcom respects their fandom, knows what they want, and doesn't try to make a cash grab out of 5, I think that they're going to be in good shape, and I'm not worried about that. But at the same time, we should always have a healthy amount of skepticism, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good a movie is or how good a video game is. The company wants your money. That's it, period. If you think anything different, then I feel sorry for you, because that's the truth. You're living in a world that you're not being honest with yourself, but that's the truth. They want your money. A lot of times it's going to be they made a great product. A lot of other times it's going to be we mismarketed this and we just did a cash grab and, you know, whatever. But whether or not that's going to happen with Resident Evil 5, I'm not too worried about it just yet, because I think we're in a pretty good shape considering how great Resident Evil 4 was. So I did a playthrough of all the core Resident Evil games 1 through Village on my channel, and 5 was obviously among those. And I remember that exact scene. You're walking through, everyone's staring at you, you feel uneasy and at rest, but you don't really know like what sort of danger you're in until it happens. And I think also too that scene where they jump with the dirt bikes and they launch into the like the battle area, and they've got the chains and they're whipping it, like all those things were like super cool, radical moments that really impressed me for a Resident Evil franchise. Granted, that probably stands out to some people as being like too actiony rather than survival horror, and I get that. But I think also too, like just from a final point on this particular subtopic, I think that there's at least for me, there's less of a fear of the survival horror if it's just like humans. And if you're seeing zombies, there's something far more scary about that, because they're a bit more unpredictable. When you see humans, you kind of know how humans are going to act, even if they're like infected with, you know, some sort of virus that's controlling them, you know, in some method. They're still human, and that takes it away. So there are definitely some other enemies that stand out to me as being a lot more scary, but they're few and far between when it comes to Resident Evil 5, and I think that's why one of the reasons why some people didn't particularly like the action dynamic of that. As far as a worst case scenario, I mean, I don't know. I don't hate what they did with the Resident Evil 3 remake. It was short, and that was my biggest gripe. Was it perfect? No. Did it have its issues? Yeah. But was it a bad game? No. It's definitely not the worst game in the Resident Evil series, for sure. But I do think if they were to try and just rush production and have it come out as like a completely disastrous, buggy mess. Worst case scenario for me is not cut content. Yes, that would suck, and I would be very disappointed, and I would feel very duped, but I'm not worried about that so much. I think worst case scenario is a Cyberpunk 2077 thing, where they work hard, because like we are at the point now where we're leaving last generation consoles behind. Like, we're already seeing it. There's franchises that are pushing PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series upgrades from their PlayStation 4 and their Xbox One consoles. They're pushing those upgrades out. Developers are talking about sequels and even DLCs that are leaving last generation consoles behind. So I think it would be a really bad take if Capcom decided they wanted to, when the game finally comes out, which would have to be 2025, 2026 at like the earliest, right? I think it would be a really bad move if they were to try and include PlayStation 4 and Xbox One consoles in that, because that hardware, like, you would probably design it for the lowest common denominator and then try to port it or scale it up to fit higher end hardware. You wouldn't work backwards that way. That's just not something that you would do. And coincidentally, at the day at which we're recording this, this is the same day that the Last of Us Part 1 came out on Steam. And I was thinking about picking it up because they had a bunch of like upgrades and stuff, and I was like, okay, that looks great. That sounds really awesome. It has overwhelmingly negative reviews on Steam right now because it is a disaster. It's crashing, it's bugging, like things just don't work. Like the game is like a huge frustrating mess. That's not like Naughty Dog. Granted, PC games, they don't have as much experience with that with their PlayStation exclusives, so I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt because it's not really like them to screw up so hard. But Capcom has experience in making games for multi-platforms. They have experience in PC ports. And even though in my Resident Evil 4 playthrough, the remake, I had one time, some weird like lag spike where I was just getting like 14 frames for some reason, and up until that point I was at like over 100, and like things just weren't working. Like it was just a disaster. I had to lower some settings down to 60 FPS, and then it went back to normal. It was fine, and I haven't had any issues since. So that wasn't really a big deal. But I always expect there's going to be PC related issues on day one, or even, until they have like a patch, because that's just how it is. More people have console platforms, like home console platforms, than they do PCs. So naturally, that's where they're going to target their releases. I think PC exclusives is not as common with AAA games these days, but my point is I think if they were to do a release with Resident Evil 5 and it came out as just like a huge disaster, like Chris's gun is missing, like his hair is like, disappearing and reappearing in, or there's just weird angles, the controls, like they could totally botch it if they put a different studio on it, or if halfway through development they decided to cut their content and start over, like a Bungie move or something like that. Like, the story needs to be cohesive and coherent. You need to be able to make sure that you're telling a story that people are familiar with and they can feel connected to, and a story that people maybe who aren't like veterans of the past Resident Evil 5 game, they can come in and they know exactly what's going on. They get the references to past events, they understand what's going on in the present, and they're looking forward to the future, and it delivers. I think those are all things that Capcom has shown to consistently do well. I don't see them just dropping the ball out of nowhere. But if there was some sort of weird issue within development and we had the game was trying to release on PlayStation 4 in 2026 for some god-awful reason, and it has to get pulled from the PlayStation Network for 6 months, and the PC version is just a huge freaking disaster, and it doesn't work for months and months on end, and you have to leave modders to try and fix your game. That's my worst case scenario. If that shit happens, I will be devastated. But I don't necessarily think that would happen. But if it does, I think anyone who has any skepticism that gets proven to be a reality in a worst case like disaster like that, you still have the original game. Like, the original game's not going anywhere. Like, it's perfectly fine. Like, they're not trying to cash grab you. It's a remake, not a remaster. I don't want a remaster. I want a remake from the ground up. Make it good. Respect the fandom. Respect the player base. Respect the people that support you. And just remember that a quick cash grab is not worth losing a fan forever. If you make a good game and you have a fan for life, you'll make money. Just make a good product. You'll continue to make money. Not a hard thing to realize. But if you screw up that big and you lose their trust, you could lose thousands, if not more, customers forever, for a lifetime, and that's like the last thing that you want. And I think CD Projekt Red knows that all too well.
Gosh, you know, honestly, as we've discussed about this behind the scenes, I really am, especially now, kind of excited, I guess you could say, to see more remakes, and I'm a little iffy if they ever do get to 6, because I think that eventually enough it is possible for them to get there. Of course, we would have to wait, I do believe, roughly around the time frame of 2032 in order for that to mark, I think, 20 years since the release of Resident Evil 6 back in like 2012. Either way, I really do hope that they don't end up remaking games like maybe 7 and 8. Maybe, of course, way down the line, they're gonna end up doing so, of course, as per tradition. I would love to see Code Veronica be remade. I think Outbreak would be incredible, and I'm not against 5, but only if the right developers are behind this, just like they were for Resident Evil 4. So again, we want to go ahead and get your thoughts down below. Do you guys agree, disagree? Share your thoughts and opinions. As always, thank you all so much for watching. So where again, if you also just so happen to be new to this channel, then I do encourage you all to head on over and smash that subscribe button, on top of giving this video a big fat thumbs up by smashing that like button down below. Tune back in for more, and with all that being said, thank you all once again, and we'll be seeing each and every single one of you down in the comment section below and in the next video. Take it easy, guys, and have a great day. Peace!